leaders, teachers, school staff and parents for their ongoing commitment to the education of our children and young people in these challenging circumstances. While schools, parents and carers have worked together to support remote learning, most would agree that our pupils are best served through face-to-face school-based learning. That's not simply about just their education, but also the mental health, social development and well-being of children throughout Northern Ireland. That is why the decision of the Executive on Tuesday is so significant. We have collectively stated as an Executive that reopening schools for all pupils is an Executive priority as we strive to protect the education, health and well-being of our young people. Our decisions to date have seen preschool pupils and primaries 1 to 3 return to school on the 8th of March, and years 12 to 14 are due to return to classroom from the 22nd of March. Last week we agreed that preschool and P1 to P3 classes would not revert to remote learning when years 12 to 14 return, and they will stay in school until Easter. We have now taken another important step with the Executive's decision to safely accelerate the pace of face-to-face learning, such that all remaining pupils in P4 to P7 will return to school from next Monday, the 22nd of March. This means that these pupils will have the welcome opportunity to reconnect in person with their schools, their teachers and their peers before the Easter break. Furthermore, subject to a final review of the prevailing public health conditions at the end of this month, the Executive has agreed that the remaining groups of pupils in years 8 to 11 will return to school following the Easter break. These decisions mean that after Easter, all pupils should be back in school for full-time face-to-face teaching, taking us to Phase 3 for schools in the Northern Ireland Executive's Pathway Out of Restrictions document. This is a significant milestone in the return to a normalised educational environment. I am confident that with the public support, we are now moving beyond the last widespread interruption to classroom learning, and that with additional mitigations, schools will remain fully open until the summer term and in future academic years, bring all the benefits of school-based learning, social interaction and shared experience. I recognise that there may be bumps in the road and the need for some localised responses to outbreaks, but our measured approach has created the best conditions for a sustainable return to the classroom for all pupils. This is not an immediate return to business as usual or even a pre-pandemic school environment. While school meals will be offered to all children in attendance at school for both free school meals and paying pupils, in the short term some areas of provision will remain paused. For example, school-managed breakfast clubs, education visits, inter-school sports and after-school activities will remain paused until advised otherwise. My department will liaise with the Department of Health to clarify the position before schools return after Easter. Furthermore, youth service provision and targeted early years programmes such as Sure Start have not yet been permitted to reopen. I wish to pay tribute to both these sectors for the innovative ways that they have provided targeted support for vulnerable children and young people throughout the pandemic, but I appreciate the limitations and frustrations of continuing to operate in this way. The Executive's Pathway Out of Restrictions document states that by the end of Phase 2 there would be a partial reopening of generic youth services and a resumption of Sure Start. I will continue to make the case for this to happen as soon as possible. I have committed to work closely with Minister Swan throughout this, I've continued to work closely with Minister Swan throughout this pandemic to ensure that my department provides the most up-to-date guidance and support to schools, taking account of all available public health advice. Schools are safe places, and there will be additional measures to help schools stay safe. The latest version of my document's guidance, issued on the 5th of March, includes additional requirements for face coverings in post-primary schools and on school transport. Schools have been supplied with additional signage to reinforce the key public messages for parents and visitors, and the EA will arrange a programme of compliance checks on school buses to ensure guidance is being followed. A further mitigation available as part of the school's return is the regular testing of people who do not have symptoms of COVID. The purpose is to find individuals who are unaware they are infected so they can be advised to isolate, thereby reducing the risk of them unwittingly spreading infection in school and elsewhere. This approach makes use of a type of self-test, the lateral flow device, otherwise known as LFD, which provides a result within 30 minutes. I made a joint announcement on Monday with Minister Swan, setting out our plans, and I've written to schools to provide more detail. Regular asymptomatic testing of staff and pupils in special schools using an alternative method has also commenced this week following a successful pilot. The rollout of asymptomatic testing in schools has 3 phases. Phase 1, from the 22nd of March, all staff in post-primary schools and all pupils in years 12 to 14 will be invited to commence familiarisation to enable twice-weekly self-testing using LFDs. This will cover the period up to the Easter break and allow staff and students who participate to self-test before attending school after Easter, providing further reassurance to staff and students returning after the holiday. Identifying infectious individuals early could ultimately reduce the risk of large groups of exam year classes having to isolate during this important period. We've chosen to begin with this group as years 12 to 14 are those with the highest prevalence of infection and where testing will bring most benefit. A range of information and resources for schools, students and parents will be provided to show staff and pupils how to correctly conduct a self-test. Engagement has also taken place this week with a representative group of school leaders and teachers and support staff trade union representatives. In phases 2 and 3 commencing after the Easter break, the programme will expand to include all staff in primary schools and then nursery, preschool and at least initially preschool education providers participating in the preschool education programme. Precise details of this later phasing are being established and will be clarified further prior to launch. No test is completely accurate, but studies indicate that LFDs have a very high degree of effectiveness at detecting those who are infectious. If a pupil or member of staff has a positive result from the LFD test, they and their household must isolate immediately. In-school contacts are not required to isolate at that stage. The individual must then take a polymerase chain reaction or PCR test, which is available in local testing centres. If the PCR test is negative, then they and their household can stop isolating and return to school. If it's positive, the COVID infection is confirmed, the person will continue to isolate and community contact tracing, including in the school, will be carried out as with any confirmed PCR test. This confirmatory PCR test is an important part of the pathway and reduces the risk of people isolating unnecessarily because of false positive results, and will ensure that we will not unnecessarily ask years 12 to 14 pupils to isolate during the key phase in their return to school and their preparation for assessments. I understand that post-primary schools, when they return next week for the years 12 to 14, will be busy welcoming back their pupils and preparing for the assessment process, but I encourage them to participate in the asymptomatic testing programme, as it's another tool to help keep our schools safe and minimise any disruption in the coming period. I recognise that the decision on Tuesday has provided less time for schools to prepare for the return to primaries P4 to P7 than I would prefer. I had previously said that I would like to give at least 10 days' notice for further changes. While that will apply for the return of post-primary pupils in years 8 to 11 after Easter, it's not been possible to do so for P4s to P7. I'd originally intended that this decision would be taken last week, but the executive decision-making on the restrictions meant that the P4 to P7 decision was considered as part of the scheduled wider executive review of the COVID restrictions that took place on Tuesday, as set out in the Northern Ireland Pathway out of restrictions process. While I accept that this is not ideal, I strongly believe that we should not delay the return to school of these pupils a day longer than is absolutely necessary. I know that teachers and all school staff will do their utmost to ensure that pupils can return safely next week. I also look forward to going out to schools, as I regularly do, to see the great work that goes on there on a daily basis. Schools are at the centre of our communities, and their full reopening is an important step on the gradual pathway out of the current restrictions. Our schools and education other than at school or IOTA centres have proved a vital service to their pupils and wider communities in recent months through the delivery of remote learning and supervised learning for vulnerable and key worker children. This meant we could both look after those who need school most and enable key workers to continue with their jobs. I must also pay tribute to our special schools, which have remained open throughout this period, providing vital education and care to those children who are amongst the most valuable in our society. It is for this reason that the Executive agreed a vaccination programme for special school staff who were supporting children who are extremely clinically vulnerable. Those staff are now receiving their vaccinations. Equally, the work done in our AOTA centres should be commended, along with the work which youth services continue to do, often remotely, over the past months. This has been a very challenging period for all, and given the significant disruption to our children's learning and mental health, our focus must now be on educational and well-being support, which will be critical to their future prospects. With the backing of the Executive, I intend to invest in the necessary resources to help pupils address any disruption to their learning that may have been faced since the start of the pandemic. And I will be bringing a paper to the Executive shortly, seeking support for a wide range of summer schools and a further engaged programme.
I thank the Minister for making a statement.